Okay, good morning, everybody, or afternoon, or evening, whatever time zone you are in. This is the fourth installment of Hunter Center for Entrepreneurship Research Seminar. We have a very distinguished guest today. He needs no introduction. Nevertheless, I'll try to introduce him. David Audretsch is one of the most well-known figures in the entrepreneurship and innovation literature. He's currently a distinguished professor and Ameritech Chair of Economic Development at Indiana University. He's very well known, both quality and quantity. He's one of the most accomplished researchers in our literature. His talk is on democracy and entrepreneurship in the era of COVID-19. So David will present his research for about 40 minutes, and then we will take some questions for about 20 minutes. For your information, this seminar is being recorded, and the questions and answers will be recorded as well. So without any further delay, I would like to give the floor to David. And David, thank you so much. We are so honored that you are here today.
Well, thank you very much, Abdullah. Thank you very much, Eloise, for the very kind invitation to join you for this seminar. I very much appreciate the opportunity to come and share thoughts and about some of the research I've been doing with my colleague Petra Moog from the University of Siegen. You know, Abdullah, when you began, you talked about the field of entrepreneurship, but when I look back, there was no field of entrepreneurship. They certainly didn't start. Most people of my generation did not start out focusing on entrepreneurship, and we never really thought about it much until I heard, probably would have been the early 1980s, and I heard the name David Birch. And David Birch, who was a kind of a part-time researcher, I think, at MIT, he kind of jolted social scientists because at that time, during that era, there was a massive problem. Not like today, there was no pandemic. On the other hand, it seemed almost as compelling as today's problem. Every Western economy in Europe, the UK, North America, Australia, Japan was suffering from alarming unemployment and stagnation. Unemployment rates were double digits in many countries, probably most countries, and they seemed to be going up. It was up and up and up. And nobody seemed to know what to do, but David Birch did. And his discovery or his insight was small business. And in a famous study, what he identified was in the United States, the context of the United States, that jobs were being generated and they were being created by small firms. In a famous quote or finding, he identified 4 out of 5 jobs are created by small business. This generated a minor army of scholars, researchers throughout the world who replicated or undertook the same kind of study for their own country, their context. I think Colin Mason, who's here, I believe he was involved, possibly for Scotland, possibly for the UK. Many people were because the problem was so important. And that's what led many of us to now what the field of what we call entrepreneurship. It was because entrepreneurship offered a solution to the most compelling problem of that time. Well, as we shifted into the 1990s and with the advent of what we call globalization, the problem also confronting society shifted or evolved. Michael Porter identified it to some extent in his book on competitiveness around 1990. And the problem was a lack of competitiveness that was quickly linked to the need for innovation in the high-cost developed countries. And again, researchers started to make the link to new firms, to small firms, to now what we call entrepreneurship roughly, and innovation. And studies showed there was a famous team at Spru down in Sussex that Keith Pavitt was among them, who identified that small firms and new firms were particularly innovative. As time evolved, links were made with entrepreneurship to the most compelling problems of that time. By the 2000s, it was clear that much of the developed world suffered from stagnant economic growth, a lack of productivity. And again, links were made to entrepreneurship and economic growth and productivity. And then most recently has been the concern about the inclusion of underrepresented communities, females, minorities, as well as social contributions, the need for social contributions. And entrepreneurship as a field has stayed vibrant, dynamic. And in some ways, I think that the viability of the field is always linked to addressing the most compelling problems of its time. Well, in this paper, this talk is loosely based on, Petra and I, what we do is to suggest that there's a problem now that's widespread in the developed countries, which is about democracy. It's under threat worldwide. And entrepreneurship seems to be linked to democracy. At least what we observe in the paper is that both have been declining in recent years, measures of both entrepreneurship and measures of democracy, not just in one country, but across a plethora of different national contexts. I won't have time to go through all of these different contexts. That's what we do in the paper. We look at several different contexts, really historical context. One looks back to Nazi Germany, and another one is to look at Eastern Europe and Central Europe after World War II, during the era of the Soviet Union. We look at the case of the United States in the 1870s and 1880s and 90s. And we see in all these contexts is both a concern about democracy, and we also observe entrepreneurship seems to be threatened or challenged. And then most recently, we have our contemporary era that, of course, with the COVID pandemic, both entrepreneurship and democracy seem to be challenged. Now, why does this matter? Well, it's people have been measuring, colleagues, scholars have been measuring the decline in entrepreneurship for some years, maybe for about 15, 20 years, depending on the country. But the measures of entrepreneurship suggest that entrepreneurship is receding. It's losing importance. This might cause concern about job generation, as I mentioned before. It might cause concern about economic growth, productivity, even the inclusion of marginalized groups. But there's an implication that says if entrepreneurship's linked to democracy and entrepreneurship declines, maybe this is a concern for a reason to be concerned about the decline in entrepreneurship. The implications for policy is that the mandate for policy has largely been about, we need entrepreneurship for jobs, we need entrepreneurship for productivity, for growth, or we need it for social concerns, social entrepreneurship, or the inclusion of social inclusion. But this might suggest that entrepreneurship is actually important as a cornerstone of democracy. There's implications for entrepreneurship scholars, for researchers, because the way we think about what actually constitutes entrepreneurship, which is kind of a moving target, kind of elusive, kind of fuzzy. I know that the leading entrepreneurship journals tend to say, we let the authors tell us what actually constitutes entrepreneurship. They make their case. This may suggest that the way we think about what constitutes entrepreneurship may be influenced if we think that there's that the independent, autonomous, decentralized decision making, that's key in the entrepreneurial process, and also is key for democracy. Well, our starting point, patriotism, my starting point is, in some ways it might have been this headline from The Economist, which, you would think has come about since the pandemic crisis, because most of us realize when we see headlines like this with the kind of decisions that have been made or imposed, limiting freedoms, limiting just the autonomy of people to make decisions, there's a lot of concern about democracy during the pandemic. But in fact, this headline from The Economist is several years old, and in fact, democracy has been there's institutions that have been measuring democracy since World War II, the Freedom House most notably, and they've measured a decline in democracy since about 2005, 2006. Not in every country, but in many countries, it's been declining. And this is kind of a surprise, because I remember after the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and there was a famous bestseller written that really got noticed all around the world by Francis Fukuyama, a political scientist. The title of his book was The End of History. And what the end of history meant with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, capitalism had won over authoritarianism. Democracy had won over communism. The great tension, the great polarization, historical tension and divide between the Soviet Union and the West was gone, the end of history. And so it's kind of jolting to realize, no, it's not gone, it's back. And there's a lot of concern about democracy, its viability. So in measuring democracy, and of course, we're just observing this and kind of users of this. It's not just Freedom House. The Economist also has a long-term kind of measurement of democracy, as well as a number of other institutions. But basically, there's a number of values and norms and practices, such as fair elections, ethnic cleansing, safety of expatriates, freedom of expression, term limits for executives, rights of migrants, really a plethora of different components of this index. And what we can see is that since early this century, that the measures of democracy have been declining. This is for all of the countries included, which is a lot of countries in the world. We also know more popularly, there's been a concern now for some years that democracy is threatened, not just in one country or two countries, but in a lot of countries. So what these indices do from Freedom House, they enable us to, we can see just very visually and graphically. This is just an example from Hungary, which has been in the news for some years. The green is the measure of democracy, and we can see since about 2010 that's been going down. And then blue is the new businesses registered, which has also been going down. Now, of course, that doesn't prove causality. The young econometricians would point out right away, well, this is not causality. And even if it's correlation, it's based on a sample of one. By the way, in the talk today in the paper, we don't try to establish causality. Rather, what we kind of do is wonder, is there some kind of connection? Because we know in the entrepreneurship literature, it's been connected, as I mentioned at the beginning, to all kinds of important social, political, community values like jobs and growth and standard of living, but not to democracy, which is important. And we can see they both move down. This is another example. Turkey, you can see almost the whole period that we graphed this from 2010 the self-employment rate's been going down, and the measure of democracy's going down. Young econometricians, by the way, can go out and run the regressions. We didn't want to do that in this, at least not yet. Maybe we'll do that if we can find the right young econometrician to team up with, because we've got this index of democracy. Well, our first historical context is Germany, and during the era of National Socialism. And in fact, we can see that, I'm not going to go through this in details, but there was a set of policies. We don't think of policies, or I don't think of National Socialism, the Nazi era of Germany, have policies, but that's really what they were. They were policies. And most people think that, well, the first thing that Adolf Hitler did when he grabbed power, when he assumed power, was to persecute Jewish people and to burn the books. No, that came later. Actually, the first thing he did was to eradicate autonomy of thinking, curtail small business, cut off the opportunity, the ability of people to start new businesses, and to cartelize virtually every industry through a series of these were kind of the policies. And don't worry about the German, but it meant that there was the first Gleichheit heißt Gleichsein, meant equality means people are the same. And so there was a policy of treating everybody the same, which meant controlling individuals, restricting their freedom. The second said individual freedoms, rights were taken away. The third one means Andersdenkende, means people who thought otherwise, who were thought differently, autonomously, dissidents. They were considered to be enemies and were dealt with like enemies. And the last one, Ordnung schaffen, meant that the National Socialist Party was responsible, or felt like they had a mandate to make sure there was order that preempted kind of disequilibrating events like, or activities like entrepreneurship. So that we can see these are the actual laws. There was a series of laws after Hitler was elected in 1933. And I'll just kind of, I won't go through each one, but the bottom one was compulsory cartelizations. Industries were cartelized under the, and that meant there was no room to start a business, or perhaps to have a small business, but it had to conform to the mandate of the National Socialists. If we go back to this picture, actually the cartelization of industry had started before in the Weimar Republic. And this meant of entrenching the existing dominant firms and impeding entry of new firms. And we can see in the period, the buildup before the National Socialists, there were 2,500 cartels. This explodes under National Socialism, so that virtually every industry, every product class was socialized. There was laws against starting businesses, certainly without the permission of the National Socialist Party. So what was the impact of these policies? And we characterize these as anti-entrepreneurship policies. Well, we can see the number of new firms crashes down after 1933. So by the end of the National Socialism period, there's really no new firms at all. They eroded or stamped out startups. And the impact was to entrench the big dominant companies and eliminate entrepreneurship. The second context we talk about in the paper is it moves over across the Atlantic to the United States during the populist era. And this should be of interest because we've heard a lot about, the populism now in the UK and in the United States and in Europe and pretty much every country. But the original populist movement, as far as we know, was in the United States and took place after the Civil War in America, roughly from 1870 to 1890, or the turn of the century. Now, Alexis de Tocqueville, a French intellectual thinker, thought leader, philosopher, had traveled to the United States way back in the early 1800s to learn about to learn about democracy, and he found his answer in the book Democracy in America. He found his answer in small business. And in this famous quote, he writes, "What most astonishes me in the United States is not so much the marvelous grandeur of some undertakings as the marvelous grandeur of so many undertakings. I'm sorry, as the innumerable multitude of small ones." It was the small businesses, the fact that people were autonomous, owned their own business, had the kind of autonomy of thinking, independence of thinking. This is what he thought were the roots of democracy in America. But by 1870 or so, this had changed. It's a political cartoon from the time. And you can see this is actually Rockefeller, the oil baron, who's controlling the government, controlling Washington, D.C. And what had happened was the emergence of what they called at that time the trusts, today we call them monopolies, had led to the railroads were making it difficult for small businesses, farmers, especially in the Midwest, to sell their products, to be viable. And for decades, really for generations, the country had consisted of small communities, small businesses, small farms, and this had been viable. After the Civil War, there was a change in technology, a change in transportation, communication, and we saw the emergence of these large, giant companies in oil, ammunition, guns back then, textiles, clothing, industry after industry. Trusts started to emerge. In the incipient steel industry, we saw consolidation from small little foundries into what became U.S. Steel. And small business was getting squeezed out in these communities. People responded. They felt like their viability was threatened. They felt they had no control, no voice in what was going on. So as they lost their businesses and control of their own autonomy, independence, decision-making, because the alternative was there was no kind of social welfare state at all back then, they would typically get forced off the land. As their businesses or farms went bankrupt, they'd have to go to the cities. They go to Chicago to meatpacking industry. They go to Cleveland to the oil refineries, or that's where the jobs were. And there was this rebellion called the populist movement, and which was a political response. And the consequence was a perceived threat to democracy. At the same time, we saw small business being threatened and being eradicated. For the first time, the country started to intervene into the freedom of business to contract, with passage of regulatory agencies such as the Interstate Commerce Act, the Antitrust Act, the Sherman Act. There's a flag depicted from Texas during this time, the populist movement, the most good for the most people. That's not what they say on the Texas flag anymore, but there was a sense of people were losing their voice in governance. In his plea to pass the Sherman Act, Senator Sherman asked the Congress, if we will not endure a king as a political power, we should not endure a king over the production, transportation, and sale of any of the necessities of life. So there was a sense that losing economic power was tantamount to losing political power as well. Well, what happened was, despite the regulation, the antitrust laws, the Sherman Act. Of course, people didn't really measure this. This was from a study done about 1970, and we can see the share of assets by the largest corporations. It kept increasing. Small business seemed to be under threat. We can see the employment share of small business was declining, at least in one of the oldest periods that they measured. And thought leaders, the great economists, Joseph Schumpeter, John Kenneth Galbraith, they seem to conclude that small scale production and things that we think about are entrepreneurial have no more place in society. Schumpeter wrote, "What we've got to accept is that the large scale establishment has come to be the most powerful engine of progress." And Galbraith wrote, "There's no more pleasant fiction than that technological change is the product of the matchless ingenuity of the small man. Unhappily, it's a fiction." In fact, the Congress established the Small Business Act. It was a preservationist law, as if they were trying to preserve an endangered species that was endangered of going extinct. When you look at the wording, it was to aid, counsel, assist, and protect the interest of small business, as if there were other goals to keep small business around, but certainly not efficiency. Well, what happened is in the 1970s, this reversed. Small business started to account for more of the jobs, as David Birch observed. And by the turn of the century, there were a lot of studies. I mean, there's David Birch's famous quote, 4 out of 5 jobs are created by small firms. By the turn of the century, it was pretty clear there was a link between entrepreneurship and economic growth. Romano Prodi, then the president of the EU, observed famously, "Our lacuna in the field of entrepreneurship needs to be taken seriously because of the evidence from economists and other types of scholars." Well, this also corresponds, I think, with now what we think was the golden age of democracy after the Berlin Wall fell. And I mentioned this book before, the famous book by Francis Fukuyama. The end of history, democracy had won out. You fast forward to today, and we have books like this one, The Myth of Capitalism, Monopolies in the Death of Competition. Because we know, whether you're talking about big tech and what's come out of Silicon Valley, to have the kind of entrepreneurial myth, well, that's the myth of capitalism. I don't have time to get in that. But we know this is just taken from The Economist, from a study from the US Census Bureau. But we can see that in the United States, the entry rates and exit rates have been declining for some time, for decades. Same thing, the Herfindahl Index, which is a measure of concentration in markets, has been increasing over time. So there seems to be a decline in dynamism, whether it's the entry rate, the exit rate, or a combination of both. And at the same time, an increase in concentration. Other studies find that the ratio of new firms to total firms, which is a kind of a measure of entrepreneurship, has declined by about 15% from 1978 to 2001. New firms are playing less of a role in the United States than they used to. The share of entrepreneurs in the working population that's really self-employed has gone down considerably over time. The share of young firms, younger than 5 years, has declined over time. The share of employment accounted for by young firms has gone down over time. Meanwhile, the share of employment of larger firms with more than 250 employees, that's increased quite dramatically over time. Vim Nod did a study looking at entrepreneurship rate, which really is the self-employment rate, or maybe the business ownership rate, depending how you characterize that. And roughly it's OECD countries. And he finds in the last 20 years, that's been declining across a broad spectrum of countries. The OECD itself did a study of OECD countries and finds since the turn of the century, the entry rate's been going down, the exit rate's been going down, and the job allocation rate has been going down. So there's a lack of, or a declining amount of entrepreneurship and dynamism in the economy. This is from the same study from the OECD. And the blue bars are the age of SMEs in a base year. They have to use different base years slightly, so it's not always the same base year. And then last year, which was 2019, or 2018 actually, it's the diamond. So what does that show? Whether it's Austria, Canada, Spain, Italy, Norway, SMEs have been aging over time. We come to the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, our current time now, and we know Freedom House, which is the institution that measures long term the extent of democracy in countries. They say the coronavirus outbreak presents a range of new challenges to democracy and human rights, and they're measuring a pervasive decline in democracy, not in every country, but in many countries. We know that the policy response, of course, every country, in some ways regions, but every country has its own particular response to the COVID crisis. The tendency seems to be to entrench the large employers. I mean, without being critical, in a way it's understandable. It's easier to deal with a few large companies, try to keep them viable, than to deal with thousands and thousands of smaller, newer companies that are hard to know what they do, hard to measure, hard to know how to reach them. And the bias is to focus on and keeping the largest companies, the largest employers viable, which entrenches the status quo and makes it more difficult for new companies or people to start new companies, grow new companies, to find markets. So we've had this kind of combination of a suppression of democracy and an existential crisis for entrepreneurship. This is from the Freedom House fairly recently, and we can see those countries that had democracies become weaker since the COVID pandemic are in the red. So you can see the United States, some of South America, a lot of Africa, some of China, some of Europe, and there's country studies. They measure democracy's gotten stronger in one country, and I can't even tell you what that country is. It's in Africa. You can see the blue, and it's about the same in most countries, 111 countries. But there's 80 countries or 80 countries where it's democracy just during the COVID pandemic is exhibiting a decline based on their measures. And we know that various measures, especially the viability of small business, is really alarming in most countries. So let me conclude by saying, we've tried to, in this paper, we certainly don't even attempt to find a causal relationship between democracy and entrepreneurship. We know that they're both kind of grounded on the same independence of thinking, autonomy of being able to act freely. These are the cornerstones of both democracy and entrepreneurship. And so in a way, it's not surprising that when one seems to decline, the other also seems to be declined. Is there a causal link? Are they both kind of manifestations of something that's deeper, more underlying? These are questions we really raise in the paper, but we think it's important. What we can see is that entrepreneurship and democracy seem to have declined simultaneously in several different national and institutional contexts. I never mentioned the post-World War II Eastern European context. In a way, that's obvious, where there was just large combines, they called them, and of course there was virtually no democracy, and there was no entrepreneurship in any way that we would think about it. So that's another context. but we do see in these examples that the two seem to move together. Is the paucity, the paucity of entrepreneurship, or the decline of entrepreneurship, is this conducive to the erosion of democracy? I mean, we don't prove that, but in a way, it's a little bit alarming to people who are worried about democracy, because it would say that the decline of entrepreneurship, it may be a cause for concern about democracy. I think, though, most importantly, is it makes us rethink the justification in the urgency for entrepreneurship policy. I mean, entrepreneurship policy, as we started, was really predicated on we need entrepreneurship to generate jobs, or we need entrepreneurship as Romano Prodi, the president of the EU, said, we need entrepreneurship to drive economic growth and prosperity. Entrepreneurship may play a role for social inclusion to address social concerns, but this suggests a different mandate for entrepreneurship that it says, and maybe it's the most important, that says a society without entrepreneurship may have trouble sustaining democracy. It also suggests, I think, or makes me at least, in Petra, rethink what we understand or focus on in the community of research of entrepreneurship scholars. There's been a tendency, I think, in the literature to focus more and more on what some people would characterize as the Silicon Valley model of entrepreneurship. It says what entrepreneurship's about is radical innovation, disruptive innovation, venture capital fueled scale-up enterprises with an exit strategy. That I'm not going to say that's not important. That may be important for growth, productivity, jobs, but the thinking of entrepreneurship in this context puts the emphasis on decentralization of decision-making, autonomy, independence, having a lot of different voices in the decision-making that's important for democracy as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. This is very thought-provoking. Given the high number of participants, we would like to take 5 questions in a row, and then they will reply to them. If you have any questions, if you can please raise your electronic hand in Zoom, then I'll pick 5 people to ask their questions. Volunteers for questions. We can start with Ian. Ian, would you like to?
Hi there, thanks Abdullah, and hi David, thanks for an interesting, thought-provoking talk. This is a subject that I hold kind of dear, so it's something that I'd love to chat to you about at another time, but there's a few things that I would maybe, one particular question that I'll concentrate on, which is, are we really talking about what's the place of corporate entrepreneurship here, and what's the relationship between corporate entrepreneurship and democracy? I was thinking in particular of the case of Japan, the golden age in Japan, and how that really was founded in a lot of cartels and big businesses, but yet this also precipitated a period of democratic growth. So I just wonder what you might respond in relation to that. Thanks.
You know,
David,
I really. Oh, go ahead.
Would you like to take all these questions and answer in a row?
Let's take them all. That's right.
Okay, thank you. I think the second person was Sam.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you, David, for a fantastic presentation there. I wondered, there's this paradox about entrepreneurship in Africa, and it's just Malawi, which is a country in blue, that has only seen democracy improve. Yet, a lot of GEM research suggests there's lots of entrepreneurship, albeit some people call it necessity entrepreneurship, in Africa and other poor countries. And I wondered, given the high levels of entrepreneurship there and, the problem with democracy in those states, including some failed states, how can we explain that linkage there, that paradox? Thank you.
Thanks, Dom?
Hi, David. Really enjoyed the talk. Thanks very much for it. I've got a question just about how your theories apply to the digital age, because what we see is lots of companies, high growth companies, winner takes all, they dominate a sector. And then what we seem to see is a lot, these are the people that are investing most in lobbying in Capitol Hill and places like that. And most of the time they're using that money to be regulated less. And that's leading to things like surveillance capitalism, which you could argue is having quite a big negative impact on democracy. So it's just to see if there was another side of the argument that maybe considered entrepreneurship as anti-democratic. Thanks.
Thanks, Dom. Horacio? Horacio, we can't hear you. We can't hear you, Horacio. Let me come back to you. Hassan?
Yes, hello, David. Thank you very much for I have 3 questions. How about China? I think they don't have democracy, as we all know, but still they have some imitative entrepreneurship, catch-up growth. Maybe that would like to comment on this. Zoltan Asch, in his report, the Global Entrepreneurship Index, he found 2016 a positive correlation between economic freedom and entrepreneurship. So probably we can, but in his index, he measures also institutions. So what do you think about this if we combine these variables together? Also, how about, I'm from Syria, so I'm concerned about Syrian refugees. Do you think there are like future recommendation, future lines regarding refugees entrepreneurs? Thank you very much.
Okay, the final one, Horacio's microphone is not working, but he says his question is very similar to Hassan's question. Dilshot, you can maybe ask the final question.
Thank you, Abdullah. Thank you very much, David, for this wonderful presentation. I have a quick question about this particular topic, and this applied in the context of the former Soviet republics. I do research on the transition economies, and the question is that in many of these particularly smaller countries, for instance, Central Asia, there's actually a lack of institutions to support the growth of small firm and entrepreneurial activities. So is there any hope for these countries, or are they in this kind of vicious circle where until they get these institutions right, they are really unable to provide the what we call the growth igniting institutions for entrepreneurship? So they don't have these institutions, so therefore how can they reach to a stage where they have entrepreneurs and small businesses actually helping them in the creation of more democratic and more free market oriented economies? Thank you.
Thanks, Dilshot. I know there are a few more questions, but just in the interest of time, we need to finish sharp because David has another engagement. Maybe we can start with these 5 questions, and if we have time, we can take a few more.
Yeah, thanks very much for those 5 really thoughtful, reflective questions. And if I think about them all, they basically remind me of a marital argument. Whatever I say, you can come up with 5 times as many examples for the opposite, which I think is yeah, because in a way we mention, or we look at, we pick our context. I mean, it's kind of a selection bias. And then what you've done is to, in your 5, just on the spot reactions, is to come up with counter examples to say, yeah, but what about this context? What about this? And some of them are historical, some of them are contemporary, where the relationship doesn't hold, but they're wonderful. And your questions are better than my answers. Going to Ian's first point about what about the era of he characterizes it as corporate entrepreneurship in Japan, really during the 1970s. And makes me smile because I was around back then, or at least in the 1980s. Nobody called it corporate entrepreneurship. They called it MITI was the planning agency. And he's right, though. It was centered around the existing corporations, for sure, companies. And what didn't seem to have a big role for what we think of as non-corporate entrepreneurship, whether you want to, but the point is it seemed to foster both a strong economic performance and it seemed to be conducive to democracy, although it wasn't sustainable. And as he mentioned in his question, it seemed to lead to a period of stagnation in the 1990s when it didn't work. But what came out of it was clearly more entrepreneurial. I think that my answer to many of these will be, we'll see in the long run, because this is really a longer run relationship. And what works for a few years or a period of time may not work for a longer period. By the way, Ian, you could have also mentioned, I'm sure you would have, had you a couple more minutes, that seems to mirror the Swedish model of, again, about the same period, the 1970s, where Sweden eschewed small business startups and instead really emphasized the existing companies with government control, either ownership or regulation. And that seemed to do very well for a period of time. That was the famous Swedish model, but it also wasn't sustainable. It wasn't sustainable over time. Then we've got, another context was raised about the African context, and I don't know. I mean, and I may perhaps Petra, if she were here, I wish she were here. She would have all the answers for sure. I don't, but would say, well, really, what are our papers more focusing on the West, the developed countries? Does this even though Freedom House measures democracy, the extent of democracy in all the countries. But we hope other people will start to embrace this in the developing country context. I would say during the optimism of the post-Berlin Wall, the end of history euphoria, there was a sense that, of course, as countries in the developing country context, as they climb the arc of economic development, they would naturally embrace democracy and refute communism and other kind of means of authoritarianism. And we know this hasn't turned out to be as simple, that's for sure. Then we get the question of I forget who asked, I'm sorry, was that you, Hassan? Perhaps, no, it was before you, about the digitalization context, contemporary context, really, but it's not so much the users of the digitalization, but rather the platform creators like Google and Facebook and so on. And the observation is that, well, these entrepreneurial startups or one-time entrepreneurial startups have evolved in such a way that they engage in what the Nobel Prize winner Manker Olson characterized as rent-seeking activity. So they'll invest in lobbying efforts to influence, shape regulation, shape the regulatory environment, shape the rules of the game in their favor. And this is kind of an anti-democratic. I think this goes, you're right to say, I think I hope people look at this more. And, an interesting question is, you kind of skirt around, are these companies, in some ways, it's like the first question by Ian. Yeah, we can say it's corporate entrepreneurship, but are they still entrepreneurial? Because many of the practices and activities seems to constitute a barrier to entrepreneurship. They seem to impede competitive entry, threats to their platform. And we know that there's, of course, competition laws, policies being undertaken in the European Union, and in Washington, D.C., there's now antitrust cases against at least Google. So this is I think is a great issue, which in a way, it looks at the life cycle of entrepreneurship. Does it evolve? Because don't forget, in that example we mentioned of the populist movement, there's Rockefeller. Rockefeller was an entrepreneur. All of these great trust leaders or CEOs or had started really as entrepreneurs. And as the industry evolves and the firm evolves, is there kind of an evolution away from entrepreneurship to what you called kind of a rent-seeking type of activity that's actually anti-entrepreneurial? It's a great issue. And I think that it certainly is alarming. I think that gets to kind of the heart of our argument in some ways. And then Hassan talks about, well, China is a great example. And I know a referee for the paper basically said, well, what about China? And then we said, well, this is clearly not a formula or an algorithm or a one-to-one correspondence. Is it possible? I don't know. It's a different kind of context. And certainly they are very entrepreneurial. You mentioned the economic freedom. Is it possible to have economic freedom without democracy? That's in Zoltan's Jedi Index. And then interestingly enough, you mentioned, as the final question did, about the role of institutions. And one thing's for sure, that the role of institutions is clearly key, both for democracy, but also in creating an environment, a context that entrepreneurs can start businesses, own businesses, grow businesses. So in the context of the former Soviet republics, the small countries, is it possible to have entrepreneurship and kind of a vibrant entrepreneurial sector without those institutions? And the answer is probably no. It's clear that I think a mistake that was made in policy way back in 1989, as with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, was the policy prescription that came from the West largely, that said, oh, the mandate should be to just deregulate the economies and introduce markets. But without those institutions, it's not possible to have an entrepreneurial driven economy. And then I suppose an implication of this topic is, without that entrepreneurship, is it possible to really have a vibrant democracy? And that's really what we're questioning, that you really need both. And it says, first you have to have the institutions for sure. Anyway, thanks very much for those thoughtful questions.
Thank you, David. I think we have maybe time for 2 more questions. I know Sarah wants to ask one question. Is there anybody else who wants to ask a question after Sarah? Okay, let's start with Sarah.
Hello. I'm trying to remember what it was I was going to ask, and if you already answered it. Yes, it was a similar kind of yes, but what about question. And really, I was curious that there was still a lot of reference to individual autonomy, personal decision making, individual agency, at the same time as making decision making open to far more people. And I wondered why the individual. Why not collective, cooperative, communitarian kind of approaches at the grassroots as a way of enhancing localized democracies and localized entrepreneurship? That's my question. It would be, wouldn't it? I mean, you could probably have predicted that one.
Is there any final question?
Oh, I'm sorry, it was wonderful. Thank you. I've got hundreds of notes and lots of inspiration. It's great, David. Thanks a lot.
I think we have enough time to answer Sarah's question, David. Shall we go on?
Yes, thanks very much for your thoughtful question. You know, I think that again it gets into, I think, challenging a little bit what's emerging more and more in the entrepreneurship research community, depending on where you go, who you talk to. But I certainly feel it, that says, oh, well, what entrepreneurship is about is Silicon Valley or the equivalent, whether it's Silicon Glen, and that says it's about a disruptive, radical innovation. It's about scale up. So there's got to be an exit strategy, probably risk capital, venture capital, perhaps. And this is the model. And, you know, I think that kind of view says, well, it tends to reject other manifestations of perhaps self-employment, owning a business, small business. You mentioned community, cooperatives, none of that, family businesses, none of that would really get included, therefore, in what thought leaders are being advised to focus on for entrepreneurship. And I think the reason is because the problem they're addressing is probably growth, scale up, and perhaps innovation. And I don't want to say those aren't problems or challenges, but I think that once you start thinking, well, maybe the priority is social inclusion, participation in democracy, it makes me think about, well, maybe the part of entrepreneurship that's important is that, so it would be organizations, now I'm to your question really, which would be like cooperatives, community ownership, that are, you know, that these would be considered to be entrepreneurship, certainly, and they're not really considered to be part of, we don't see a lot of research done on these things in the entrepreneurship literature, but this would say they're important because they promote, they're conducive to democracy. You know, I didn't get, in fact, we don't say in the paper, but we certainly could, or somebody else could, you know, what are the manifestations of a lack of democracy? You know, I didn't talk about elections here in the US, Brexit in the UK. I didn't talk about the opioid crisis we have from alienation in many of the rural abandoned communities. But there's all kinds of manifestations and I wouldn't even say that's, you know, that's not my research area, but there seems to be a connection to the alienation that people feel when they're not participating. So you just talked about organizational forms, cooperatives, community ownership that put the emphasis on inclusion, participation. It even makes me rethink, what does opportunity mean? I mean, in a way, that's always a cornerstone in the entrepreneurship literature. But, you know, what is opportunity? We know social entrepreneurship, it's not exactly only a profit opportunity. It's a different kind of opportunity. So when I look at through this lens, I think, yes, certainly cooperatives are, maybe they're the most important kind of organization for entrepreneurship, when the concern is participation, inclusion that's conducive to democracy. Now, about the individuals, I mean, my sense is in cooperatives, I'm a member of a food cooperative here in Bloomington, and despite what I think when I get ordered to work once a month, a couple hours, you know, it's voluntary, it's individual's decision. So that, yes, it's collective, but it's based on a kind of you know, I'll still kind of defend and it goes back to a previous question or point made by Hassan, that there's a kind of freedom of choice. And just like when people choose to work for an entrepreneurial firm, startup, or they choose to work for an incumbent organization, there's a free choice. I think that what starts to worry me, but worry, you know, people, is that when there's more coercion or less free choice involved. So I don't see the emphasis on autonomy and independence of choice doesn't mean everybody should be self-employed at all, but it does seem to be that's important for democracy. This goes back to Alexa de Tocqueville, who kind of made that sense of, if we've got a diversity of independent thinkers, this is probably conducive to democracy. But on the other hand, collective managerial worker-owned firms is maybe more conducive to democracy, maybe a different kind of form of entrepreneurship than what we've thought about in the entrepreneurship literature. It's a long answer to a very thoughtful question, Sarah. Thank you.
That was just absolutely fabulous. Thank you. Thank you. That indeed a really thought-provoking answer.
Thank you very much for your questions. And thank you, David. It was our honor to host you. It was really very thought-provoking speech. It was our signature event for this year's seminar series. Can I invite everybody to unmute themselves for a round of applause for David, please?
Thank you
very much again.
Can we whistle too?
Yeah, I can't wait to come visit.
You promise?
I promise. Better times.
Thank you very much, everybody. This is the end of the speech. Thanks.